How close did humans come to extinction? The fire is small. It has to be small. Fuel is difficult to find. And what they have must last the night, and possibly tomorrow night, and possibly the night after that. The sky has been wrong for weeks. Not dark in the way of ordinary clouds. Not gray in the way of rain. Wrong in a different way. An ash gray that doesn't lift. A dimness that persists even at midday. The sun visible only as a slightly brighter patch in the smear of gray overhead. The group around the fire is small too. You could count them on your hands with fingers left over. Some of them remember when there were more. Some of them are too young to remember anything else. The cold came wrong this year. Too early and too deep for the season, for a region that should be warmer than this. The animals have moved or disappeared. The plants are wrong. The fruiting things didn't fruit. The tubers are sparse and small. The familiar patterns of the landscape are behaving in ways that none of the older members of the group have ever seen. They don't know why any of this is happening. They don't know what Toba is or was. They don't know that 800 kilometers to the east, a distance so large it's incomprehensible to anyone who has never traveled more than a few days from their birthplace. A mountain did something that no mountain had done in 2 million years. They just know that something is broken, and that the fire has to stay small, and that they need to find food in the morning. This is approximately what it looked like 74,000 years ago, when the human species nearly ceased to exist. Every person alive today, all 8 billion of us, every human being in every country on every continent, carries in their cells a record of what happened. The record is written in DNA, and what it says is there were almost none of us. For a period in the deep human past, the entire population of Homo sapiens was so small, so reduced, so close to the edge, that the genetic diversity of all 8 billion people alive today is less than the genetic diversity of a single troop of a few hundred chimpanzees. Let that sit for a moment. We share approximately 98.7% of our DNA with chimpanzees. The genetic variation within chimpanzee populations, the differences between one chimp and another, is substantially greater than the genetic variation across all of humanity. If you pick 2 chimpanzees at random from the same troop, they are, genetically speaking, more different from each other than any 2 randomly selected humans on Earth, regardless of what those humans look like or where they come from. This is extraordinary. It is the kind of genetic signature that, when population geneticists encounter it, means one specific thing. At some point in the recent evolutionary past, the population went through a bottleneck. A period so severe, the population so small, that almost all the genetic variation that existed before it was lost. What came after, what we all come from, descended from the survivors of something that killed almost everyone. Population geneticists who studied the human genome in the 1990s found something striking. Our genetic diversity is almost catastrophically low for a species our size. The variation that accumulates across thousands of generations of a healthy population, it's mostly missing. The best estimates suggest that at the worst point, the number of humans actually reproducing and contributing to the gene pool dropped to somewhere between 10 and 15,000 individuals. Some estimates go lower. The size of one small town, everyone alive today, descends from that group. Now, meet the event that most researchers believe was responsible. 74,000 years ago, on the island of Sumatra in what is now Indonesia, a volcano erupted. Not in the way that volcanoes you've heard about erupted. Not Vesuvius burying Pompeii in ash. Not Krakatoa generating a massive explosion. Those were large events by ordinary standards. Toba was not an ordinary event. The Toba supervolcano erupted with an explosive force that ejected approximately 2,800 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. The 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens, one of the most photographed volcanic events of the 20th century, ejected approximately 1 cubic kilometer. Toba ejected roughly 2,800 times that amount. The ash layer from Toba has been found in sediment cores across South Asia, the Arabian Sea, and East Africa, a geological calling card visible in rock layers from one side of a continent to the other. It was the largest volcanic eruption that has occurred anywhere on Earth in the last 2 million years. And it happened while our species was still young and spread thinly across a single continent. The result was a volcanic winter. Not a single bad season, not a difficult year. Darkness descended across the world. The sunlight thinned, temperatures dropped, food became scarce, then scarcer, then for many people simply gone. Here's what that meant in practice. The eruption blasted enormous quantities of sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere, where it converted to sulfuric acid aerosols. tiny droplets that scattered incoming solar radiation, reflecting sunlight back into space before it reached the Earth's surface. Global temperatures may have dropped by between 3 and 5 degrees Celsius on average, and the effect persisted for years, possibly a decade. That number sounds small until you put it on the ground. Modern agriculture, the highly optimized global food production system that feeds 8 billion people, would face serious disruption from a sustained 1-degree drop. A 3 to 5 degree drop sustained over years is not a disruption. It is a collapse. For a world with no agriculture, no food storage, no supply chains, a world where every person's caloric survival depended entirely on what the local landscape produced right now. The math was brutal. The animals that forager bands hunted moved to follow the food that supported them. The plants failed to produce. The seasonal patterns that human knowledge systems were calibrated to. The exact week the fig trees fruited. The precise location where tubers grew largest. The migration routes of the prey animals. All of it shifted in ways that rendered accumulated knowledge temporarily useless. A forager who knew exactly when the fig trees fruited in their territory found, in the years after Toba, that the trees weren't fruiting. The seasonal knowledge accumulated over generations was temporarily wrong. When a band drops below a certain size, survival becomes harder. Too few hunters means less protein. Too few gatherers means less plant food. Too few adults to care for children means higher child mortality. And once a group falls below a critical threshold, decline accelerates. The group below a functional minimum doesn't recover gradually. It contracts faster as it gets smaller, until the specific knowledge those people carried, where the water is, which plants are toxic, how to read the animals in this particular landscape, disappears with them. This is the version of extinction that almost happened to our species. Not a dramatic single event with a clear before and after. A slow contraction, band by band, season by season, in landscape after landscape, until what remained of humanity occupied a fraction of the territory that had existed before. Not gone, not quite, but close enough that the genetic consequences are still visible in every cell of every human alive today. The information that groups elsewhere have stopped existing doesn't reach the remaining groups, because the people who would carry that information have stopped existing too. Across Africa and Asia, bands contracted into smaller bands, and smaller bands disappeared entirely. The population that had been spread across a vast territory concentrated into the few places where survival was still barely possible. Stanley Ambrose at the University of Illinois proposed in 1998 what became known as the Toba catastrophe theory, that the volcanic winter following the Toba eruption drove the global human population to near extinction, producing the genetic bottleneck that population geneticists had been documenting in human DNA. The timing fit, the magnitude of the event fit, the genetic signature fit. The theory has been debated since Ambrose proposed it. Some archaeologists point to evidence of human activity in South Asia, both before and after Toba, that seems too continuous to represent complete population collapse. Some researchers argue the bottleneck was real, but predated Toba, or had a different cause. What is not debated? The human population went through something extreme in the deep past. The genetic evidence of this is clear and consistent, and the timing corresponds to one of the most catastrophic geological events in recent Earth history. Here is what we know about the survivors. Africa is where the evidence points most strongly. The genetic diversity that exists in African populations today is greater than the diversity of all non-African populations combined. This is consistent with Africa being where the bottleneck population persisted and slowly recovered, while the populations that eventually left Africa carried only a subset of that diversity. Coastal environments may have been crucial to survival during the worst years. Coastlines provide a specific kind of resource stability that inland environments don't. Shellfish, fish, seaweed, and other marine resources that continue to be available even when terrestrial ecosystems are severely disrupted. The ocean keeps producing food even when the ash-dimmed sky makes plant growth difficult on land. Stanley Ambrose and others have pointed to evidence of sophisticated shellfish exploitation at sites like Pinnacle Point in South Africa, dating to approximately 75,000 years ago, right around the time of Toba, as evidence of populations surviving by shifting to coastal resources that remained available when inland food sources were depleted. Picture one of these groups. The fire is built at the base of a cliff, where the wind doesn't reach it, and the rock overhead provides some shelter. Below, close enough to hear, the ocean. The tide is going out. In the morning, there will be shellfish exposed on the rocks, mussels, limpets, whelks, and the group will spend hours harvesting them, cracking them open with the smooth, rounded stones they've been collecting and keeping for exactly this purpose. The protein is reliable. The location is reliable. The inland landscape, where relatives and neighbors once lived and moved and which the group's memory was calibrated to, has become unreliable and dangerous. They are doing something that the groups who have already disappeared did not do, or could not do, or ran out of time to do. They found a resource that kept producing when everything else stopped. This is not wisdom exactly. It is a combination of prior knowledge, geographic luck, and willingness to shift when the old patterns broke down. Some groups had this combination. Most didn't. They don't know that they are among the last. They may not know the extent of what has happened beyond their immediate territory. The information that groups elsewhere have stopped existing doesn't reach them, because the people who would carry that information have stopped existing too. But they are here, and they keep the fire going, and in the morning they crack open shellfish on the rocks, and the group eats, and the children survive another day, and the specific chain of survival that runs from them to everyone alive today remains unbroken. Not the only survivors. The bottleneck was severe, but it was not total. Small groups persisted in different locations, surviving through different combinations of resource access, behavioral flexibility, and what has to be called luck. The specific knowledge each group had, the specific resources available in their specific location, the specific decisions made by specific people at specific moments. All of it determined which groups made it through the years when almost no one did. And then, slowly, the sky cleared. The sulfuric acid aerosols fell out of the atmosphere over years and decades. The sunlight returned to its normal intensity. The temperatures began to recover, gradually and unevenly. The ecosystems, disrupted and simplified by the volcanic winter, began to rebuild. Plants grew. Animals returned from refugia where they had persisted through the worst years. The landscape began to resemble something that a human forager could work with again. The survivors expanded. Not all at once. Not through any coordinated plan. Through the normal process of small groups moving into territories that had been emptied or reduced, finding food, having children, growing slightly in number, and then splitting when the group got too large for the local resources to sustain, with one part moving into new territory, while the other stayed. This process, expand, split, move, is the basic mechanism by which human populations spread across landscapes. It is slow. It requires generations. A population doubling every 25 years covers enormous distances over 1,000 years. But no single person experiences it as a grand migration. Each person experiences it as moving to the next valley because this one is getting crowded, finding adequate food there, having children who repeat the process. Multiplied across tens of thousands of years, this is how a species of a few thousand people in Africa became 8 billion people distributed across every habitable environment on Earth. What made the survivors survive when so many didn't? The honest answer is that we don't know with certainty. Geography played a role. Populations near stable coastal resources had options that inland populations didn't. Prior knowledge played a role. Groups that already had experience harvesting marine resources could pivot to them more readily. Social flexibility played a role. Groups willing to incorporate survivors from collapsed neighboring bands stayed larger, longer, and preserved more collective knowledge. But some of it was luck. The specific band that happened to be near a productive coastline when the inland resources collapsed. The specific elder who happened to know which backup foods were available when the primary ones failed. The specific child born with slightly greater resistance to the infections that were circulating in the stressed, crowded conditions of survivors clustering around the remaining resources. This is uncomfortable to contemplate. The difference between the groups that survived and the groups that didn't was not, in all cases, superior skill or intelligence or virtue. Some of it was the specific combination of circumstances, geography, knowledge, social structure, and chance that determines whether any particular group makes it through a catastrophic period. David Reich at Harvard has spent 2 decades using ancient DNA to trace how human populations spread across the world. What ancient genetics reveals is a story of repeated splitting and migration, small founder groups moving into new territories, establishing themselves, and becoming the ancestral population for everyone who came after in that region. The genetic evidence suggests that approximately 60 to 70,000 years ago, roughly 10 to 15,000 years after Toba, a small population made the crossing out of Africa, following coastal routes through the Arabian Peninsula and into South Asia. This is the founding population of every non-African human on Earth. They were already a subset of the post-bottleneck African population, already carrying less diversity than the Africans who stayed behind. Their descendants reached Australia, perhaps 65,000 years ago, crossing water gaps that required some form of watercraft, the first clear evidence of long-distance ocean crossing in human history. They reached Europe perhaps 45,000 years ago, where they encountered Neanderthals and interbred with them, which is why non-African humans today carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. They reached the Americas perhaps 15 to 20,000 years ago, filling 2 entire continents that no human had ever set foot in. The entire non-African world, every human being outside Africa, all their descendants, all their history and culture and language, and everything they built, populated by descendants of what was, at some earlier point, a very small group of people who had survived something that killed most of their species, and then moved. Consider what this means for your own existence. You have 2 biological parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents. Each generation back doubles the number of ancestors. Go back 1,000 generations, roughly 20,000 years, a fraction of the time since Toba, and the mathematical number of your ancestors becomes larger than the number of humans who have ever lived, which means the lines converge. The same individuals appear in your ancestry multiple times through different paths, because the population was small enough that everyone was related to everyone else in multiple ways. This is not a theoretical abstraction. It means that if you could trace your family tree back far enough, in the deep past, the 2 branches eventually join. That the cousins of the family tree become the same people. That at some point before Toba, every person who was going to survive was already connected to every other person who was going to survive through a web of kinship that covered the entire surviving human population. Now go back 74,000 years to the narrowest point of the bottleneck. Every person alive today is descended from the individuals who survived. Not some of the survivors, all of them. The entire surviving population of Homo sapiens is in your ancestry. The person who knew which coastal plants were safe. The person who figured out how to crack open the shellfish. The elder who remembered the last time the sky was wrong. The child who survived a fever that killed the adults around them. They are all your ancestors. Every one of them. This is not a poetic claim. It is a mathematical consequence of how heredity works when the population goes through a small enough opening. Here is what this means for how we understand human diversity today. The visible differences between human populations, skin tone, facial structure, hair texture, represent a remarkably small fraction of overall human genetic variation. Geneticists estimate that visible traits associated with geographic ancestry account for somewhere between 6 and 15% of total human genetic variation. The rest, the overwhelming majority, is variation within populations, not between them. Any 2 people chosen at random from anywhere on Earth are more genetically similar to each other than they are to most other species. The genetic distance between the most genetically different human populations on Earth is smaller than the genetic distance between 2 chimpanzee troops living in adjacent forests. This is not a coincidence. It is a direct consequence of the bottleneck. When the entire species passed through a population numbering in the low thousands, the scope of variation that could survive that passage was profoundly limited. What came out the other side, all 8 billion of us, is built from what that small group carried. The differences that accumulated afterward over tens of thousands of years of geographic separation and local adaptation are real, but they are recent and they are small, and they sit on top of a foundation of shared origin that tells a specific story. We all nearly didn't make it. We all made it from the same place. We are, in the most literal genetic sense, family, at a closer remove than any map of human difference would suggest. You are watching this at some point in human history when there are 8 billion of us. Every language ever spoken, every city ever built, every piece of music ever composed, every child ever born, all of it descends from the group that didn't stop, that found food when there was almost none to find, that had children despite everything that was making it difficult, that kept a small fire burning on a darkened coastline while most of the world went quiet. You are the specific consequence of the fact that they made it. The fire stayed lit, and because it stayed lit, you are here. That small fire in the ash-gray darkness was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of you. If this video made you think about where we all come from, drop a comment below. What surprised you most? And if you want more on what ancient humans actually went through to get us here, the channel has a whole series on it. Subscribe so you don't miss what's next.